11 stories of grinding iron. 7,000 tons of stone-laced coal pouring through its belly every single day. And for the better part of 70 years, sitting inside that iron, with their boots jammed into rivers of moving rock, were children as young as 8 years old. In 1906, a newspaperman trying to describe what was rising over the hills of Pennsylvania's coal country settled on 2 words: enormous, praying monsters. He wasn't reaching for poetry. He was reporting what he saw: a building that ate mountains and never stopped chewing, day or night, 6 days a week, for decades at a time. Inside it, rollers with teeth that could pulp stone, screens that never paused to let a tired arm rest, and a chute system that ran on gravity alone, which meant it never once asked anyone's permission to keep moving. This is a story about that building, about the machine that mechanized one of the dirtiest, most dangerous jobs in American industry. And then, having mechanized it, decided the cheapest way to finish the job was to put a child inside the gears. We're going to find out how a piece of mining equipment built to crush stone ended up needing the smallest hands in Pennsylvania to run it. We're going to find out what happened when those hands slipped. And we're going to find out why, more than 100 years later, with almost every one of these machines gone from the landscape, the ground where they stood still won't let Pennsylvania forget what happened inside them. Because here's the part that should bother you. The technology to replace those children existed years before the last one clocked out. We'll get to why nobody used it. The iron throat of Schuylkill County. Strip away the steel and the soot, and a coal breaker is a simple idea. It's a building shaped like a funnel, designed to do 3 things to raw anthracite coal: break it, sort it, and clean it, all before it ever reaches a customer's furnace. Simple idea, brutal execution. Before any of this existed, coal didn't need a building. It needed a man and a hammer. Anthracite first caught on as a fuel around 1808, when a Wilkes-Barre man named Jesse Fell figured out how to burn it on an open grate. And within 20 years, it was heating homes and firing furnaces across the eastern seaboard. That was the opportunity. Here was the problem. Anthracite doesn't come out of the ground clean. It comes out shot through with slate, streaked with sulfur, mixed with rock and clay and bone-hard impurities that ruin a fire and ruin a furnace if you don't pick them out first. For the first few decades of American coal mining, that picking was done the only way anyone knew how. A miner with a sledgehammer, breaking lumps by hand, raking out the good pieces with a 2-inch tooth rake, leaving the rest behind in the mine as worthless. Even that crude method drew blood. A sledgehammer swung wrong against unpredictable rock could shatter a wrist as easily as a lump of coal, and the mines themselves were already killing and maiming men by the hundreds before a single breaker ever rose above the tree line. That worked when the country needed a little coal. It did not work when the country needed an empire's worth of it. So in 1844, a Philadelphia gas plant supervisor named Joseph Batten built something new: 2 cast iron rollers. One studded with teeth, one punched with holes, mounted so that coal fed between them would crack apart and tumble down through an angled, mesh-lined cylinder that sorted it by size as it fell. A fellow Pennsylvanian, Gideon Bast, licensed the idea and erected the first commercial coal breaker in Schuylkill County on February 28, 1844. No detailed account survives of what happened the day Bast first fired it up. The record simply isn't there. Was it a clean success, or did something jam, snap, or fail on that very first run? Nobody recorded it, which is its own kind of answer. In an industry that wasn't yet writing down its accidents, a quiet failure on day 1 would have looked exactly like every other unremarkable Tuesday. What the record does show is what happened next. Within a generation, that one experimental contraption of rollers and screens had multiplied across the anthracite fields of northeastern Pennsylvania, and by 1866, it had grown into the multi-story screen-stacked structure that anyone touring the coal region would recognize on sight. Here's the part that mattered most. The breaker didn't just speed up the work, it obliterated the old math entirely. A miner with a hammer might spend a full day breaking and culling a few tons of coal by hand. A breaker, once it was running, could put that same volume through in minutes by replacing one man's careful, controllable swing with hundreds of pounds of iron that never paused to check what or who was in its path. That kind of leap doesn't happen quietly. Within a few decades, every colliery of any size in the anthracite region needed one of these buildings just to stay competitive. A coal operator without a breaker wasn't selling clean, grated coal at all, which meant a coal operator without a breaker wasn't really in business anymore. Word of these machines spread through the coal country, and when people from outside the region finally saw one running, heard the rollers grinding, felt the ground shake under an 11-story building stuffed with moving iron, the reaction wasn't admiration. It was closer to dread. Enormous preying monsters wasn't a description anyone gave to something they found comforting, and it wasn't a description anyone gave from a safe distance either, and the danger wasn't waiting for boys to show up first. Even in those earliest decades, before a single child ever sat at a chute, grown miners working around the rollers and crushers lost fingers and hands to the same machinery because guards and shutoffs simply weren't part of the design vocabulary yet. The breaker was dangerous from the day it was switched on. The only question still open was who exactly would be standing closest to the part of the job nobody had figured out how to mechanize. Because could a machine that crushed stone into gravel actually tell the difference between a piece of slate and a piece of coal? That was it. That was the one job the rollers and the screens couldn't do. They could break it. They could sort it by size. Neither one could look at a chunk of anthracite and decide, this piece is fuel, this piece is garbage. That decision still needed eyes and a hand. And in the 1860s, with anthracite production exploding and labor cheap and plentiful in the company towns spreading across Luzerne, Schuylkill, Lackawanna, and Carbon counties, the coal operators found the cheapest possible source of eyes and hands they could find. They were attached to children. They'd built a machine that did the hard part. Now came the part nobody wanted to talk about, what they put inside it to finish the job. 11 floors of grinding steel. Picture the building from the inside, floor by floor, because the breaker's design and the danger inside it were never two separate things. They were the same machine. At the very top, mine cars rolled in on elevated track and dumped their raw coal straight down into the structure. Tons of it, all at once. Gravity doing the first stage of the work for free. One floor down, the coal hit the crushing level. Rows of interlocking toothed iron rollers built to break the largest lumps into manageable, marketable sizes. Those teeth didn't know the difference between a chunk of slate and a man's forearm. And in the early decades, with no guardrails and no shutoffs, that distinction sometimes had to be learned the hard way. The grinding never stopped. It couldn't. A breaker that paused was a breaker losing money, and the men who owned these buildings did not like losing money. Below the crushers came the screens, long, slowly, revolving cylinders of wire mesh, graded from fine at one end to coarse at the other, sorting the broken coal into the sizes the market wanted. Pea, buckwheat, chestnut, egg, lump. This is where engineering met geography in a way that made the whole project feel close to impossible. Pennsylvania's anthracite seams sit folded and crushed by an ancient mountain-building event geologists call the Acylation Revolution. The same violence that made the coal harder and purer than anywhere else in the country also packed it tighter against rock and slate that had to be physically separated from it, ton after ton, hour after hour, without slowing the line. Nothing on this scale had been attempted anywhere else in the world. More than 95% of the entire Western Hemisphere's anthracite came out of this one stretch of northeastern Pennsylvania, and virtually all of it had to pass through a building like this one before it reached a single customer. So how do you remove rock from a fast-moving river of coal at a rate of thousands of tons a day, with 1,840 seconds and 1,850 seconds technology? You don't. Fully. Not yet. Engineers had jigs and water washers on the drawing board for decades, mechanical separators that promised to do the cleaning without hands at all. But could washing the coal solve the problem on its own? Not cleanly. Washing coal with water also stripped out sulfur, but the process produced sulfuric acid as a byproduct, and the men and boys who handled freshly washed coal often came away with chemical burns on their hands to go along with the cuts. Even the solutions in this building came with their own teeth, and the chain of operation didn't run in one straight line either. Coal too large for a given screen's mesh didn't just disappear, it got kicked back to the crushers and run through again, over and over, until it was small enough to pass. Picture a building 11 stories tall doing that, continuously, to thousands of tons of rock a day, breaking, screening, rejecting, re-breaking, in a loop that never fully closed. That's not a single machine. That's an assembly line, stacked vertically inside a structure that, at its biggest, rose taller than most church steeples in the towns around it and shook the ground for a quarter-mile when fully loaded. For now, here's what existed instead of full mechanization. Below the crushers and the screens, on the levels where the coal had already been broken down to size, builders installed long wooden chutes, essentially slides, down which the crushed, sorted coal streamed continuously toward the bins and rail cars waiting below. And straddling those chutes, perched on wooden plank seats with their boots dangling directly into the moving stream of rock and coal, sat the only sorting mechanism the breaker didn't have to buy: a human being, usually a small one. The breaker, in other words, mechanized everything except the one task that mattered most for safety, and then filled that gap with the cheapest, smallest, most replaceable workforce the industry could legally get away with. Hold on to that. We still haven't gotten to the part where a machine that could have made all of this unnecessary sat finished and working for years, while companies kept choosing children instead. That's coming. 6 stories, 8 stories. By the time the largest of these buildings were finished, 11 stories, swallowing thousands of tons a day, shaking the ground for a quarter-mile around when fully loaded. Built mostly of timber in the early decades, which meant the entire structure groaned, flexed, and occasionally caught fire from the friction and dust generated by its own machinery. A wooden building, soaked in years of accumulated coal dust, sitting directly above its own furnace-grade source of fuel. The coal dust itself was so thick during a dry run that workers wore open-flame lamps strapped to their heads just to see the chute in front of them. Lamps burning inside a building saturated with combustible coal dust, a detail that should make your stomach turn a little, and it should have made theirs too. The gearing was brilliant. The throughput was a miracle of its era. But somewhere between the crusher and the loading dock, this machine still needed something it couldn't manufacture out of iron: judgment. In a body small enough to fit where the chutes were narrow and the pay could stay low, the boys who fed the throat. So who fit? Boys. Mostly between 8 and 12 years old, though the law on paper said different things at different times, and the paper was routinely ignored. A reporter for the Times of Philadelphia, touring the coal region during the long strike of 1902, wrote that nowhere else in the world were children put to work this young, this hard, for this much money, which in the anthracite fields generally meant well under $1 a day. Here's what an actual shift looked like. 7 in the morning until 4 or 5 in the afternoon, 6 days a week, with an hour off for lunch if the foreman allowed it. The boys sat in rows along the chutes on simple wooden boards, legs extended into the moving coal, using their boots to slow the flow when the slate ran thick, and kicking it along when the stream ran clean. Each boy was responsible for catching whatever slate the boy above him on the chute had missed, a built-in margin for error that meant nobody's mistake stayed contained to just one set of hands. The rollers ground without pause. The crushers added their own crunch on top of it. The noise alone was enough to do lasting damage. Boys who spent years on the chutes routinely grew up with diminished hearing, a quieter, slower injury than a missing finger, but every bit as permanent. And over all of it, all day, every day, hung a black curtain of coal dust thick enough to obscure a boy sitting 3 feet away. But could a child's hands hold up to 10 hours a day of that? Not for long, and not without damage. The slate they were pulling out wasn't smooth. It was sharp, often jagged from the crushers, and boys left their shifts with fingers cut and bleeding as a matter of routine, not incident. Many lost fingers outright to the conveyor belts and rollers they worked beside. Some lost feet, some lost legs. But the machine itself was never the easy part of the job either. Wet coal, especially in winter, would cake and clog inside the revolving screens until the whole cylinder jammed solid, and somebody had to clear it, by hand, reaching into a half-stopped mechanism that the foreman wanted running again in seconds, not minutes. Chains snapped under the constant load and had to be rethreaded while coal kept arriving from above, whether the chute beneath was ready for it or not. There was no such thing as routine downtime in a building that owners had built specifically to never stop. So the boys closest to a jam were also the boys most likely to be the ones reaching into it. Take Neil Gallagher, a boy from Wilkes-Barre who started at a Pennsylvania coal mine at the age of 11. By 18, according to the photographer who documented him, Gallagher had had a leg amputated twice. He received no compensation from the company. Not for the first amputation, not for the second. He simply went back to work in whatever capacity his body still allowed, because the alternative was no income at all for a family that needed his dollar a day more than it needed his leg. It wasn't only boys who ended up sitting at those chutes either. Coal companies also placed older men there, miners who'd been disabled or worn out by years underground and had nowhere else in the operation to go. The breaker, in that sense, sat at both ends of a working life at once. Too young to be anywhere else, or too broken to be anywhere else. Either way, you were small, cheap, and expendable, and the chute didn't care which. And there were men standing over these boys to make sure none of it slowed down. Foremen walked the rows of seated children carrying sticks, prodding or striking anyone whose pace dropped. One observer at the time called it what it looked like, not employment, but something closer to slavery, dressed up in a pay envelope. The phrase that stuck to the work itself, passed down through the families who lived it, was simpler and harsher: galley slave. That's how a former breaker boy, decades later, still grown old, described what his childhood had actually been. And the breaker, brutal as it was, turned out to be only the first stop on a longer and darker career path, not the worst of it. As breaker boys aged into their teens, the colliery moved them underground. First as door tenders controlling the ventilation gates that kept poison gas from building up in the tunnels, then as mule drivers hauling coal cars through the dark, and eventually into the ranks of full miners themselves, working the same seams that had fed the breaker since they were children. Down there waited cave-ins, explosions, and gas that killed without warning. Dangers the breaker had only been a long, slow introduction to, but you'd be wrong to picture these boys as simply broken by it. They weren't. Breaker boys had a reputation in the coal region for fierce independence and an open contempt for adult authority that started early and never really left them. They formed their own unions inside the larger mine unions. They went on strike. Actual, organized strikes, not tantrums. And when the breaker boys of a colliery walked off their seats, the entire operation stopped, because there was no mechanism on any floor of that building that could replace what they did. In September of 19, as the broader anthracite coal strike spread across the region, breaker boys joined the walkout alongside grown men, twice and 3 times their age, fully aware that their labor, small, cheap, replaceable on paper, was in practice the one thing the breaker could not run without. Newspapers covering that strike noted, almost with surprise, that the boys had become some of the most enthusiastic strikers in the entire coal field, and that when operators tried to negotiate a return to work, they sometimes found themselves asking the boys' own parents to talk their sons back onto the chutes. Proof, if anyone still needed it, of exactly how much leverage these children actually had once they stopped sitting down at their seats. 2 years later, when Union President John Mitchell rode through Shenandoah during the strike of 1902, the boys themselves lined the street as his honor guard, marching behind a banner that read, "We are slaves now, but Mitchell will set us free." For months, sometimes years, this was simply how the machine ran. Boys in, slate out, coal down the chute, day after day. And then the small accidents that had always been part of the routine started escalating into something the company couldn't quietly absorb from anymore. When the throat swallowed a boy, every breaker boy's hands carried the same evidence. Nicked, scarred, sometimes missing pieces entirely. That was the baseline. That was Tuesday. The real danger climbed in stages, and it rarely climbed in a straight line. It started small, a near miss here, a glove, if a boy even had gloves, Caught for half a second in a moving belt and yanked free just in time. It escalated. A finger lost to a roller's teeth. A hand crushed reaching for a jammed gear that hadn't fully stopped turning, because stopping the breaker cost the company money it didn't want to spend. Then it escalated again, the way Neil Gallagher's body kept paying the same machine twice. And at the top of that staircase waited the accidents nobody walked away from at all. How many close calls came and went before one of them finally made it into a newspaper with a name attached? More than anyone bothered to count. Most near misses left no paper trail whatsoever. A boy went home with a story to tell his family and showed up again the next morning, and nobody wrote any of it down. It was only when the staircase reached its final step that the colliery's bookkeeping, and occasionally a local reporter, took any notice at all. In the Wyoming coal fields during the back half of the 19th century, the mines and the breakers attached to them averaged roughly 5 deaths a month between them. Some years were far worse than the average. 67 fatalities in 1,872, 62 in 1,875, 59 in 1,879. And death inside these operations did not wait for anyone to grow up first, nor did it always wait for anyone to grow old. Readers from that period, name 3 10-year-old boys among the dead. Evan Jones, killed at the Kapas Shaft on November 1, 1879. John Murray, killed at the Tompkins Colliery on January 6, 1872. And Joseph Nara, killed at the GL line on January 16, 1872. At the other end of the same ledger sit Hugh Harmick, age 69, killed at the Grassy Island Breaker, and Noah Morgan, age 72, killed on Christmas Eve at the Mount Pleasant Colliery. 3 boys, 2 old men, 1 machine that didn't distinguish between them. Inside the breaker specifically, the danger had a particular shape. 1 careless slip off a wooden seat, 1 missed handhold reaching for a jammed gear, and a boy could go straight down into the same rollers and crushers that were built to pulverize stone. Some fell into the gears and were crushed instantly, their bodies recovered by supervisors only once the shift had ended and the machine had finally been allowed to stop. Others were caught in the sheer rush of coal itself and smothered before anyone even realized they'd gone under. The chutes that fed 1,000 tons of coal an hour did not care whether what they were moving was rock or a child. For decades, this is how the local papers handled it. A dead breaker boy was a few column inches buried deep in the paper. A name, an age, a colliery, and nothing more. Routine enough that editors didn't see the need to dwell on it. That changed only when the story stopped being about one boy at a time. When reformers and reporters started adding up the deaths across an entire region, across an entire decade, the small items started looking less like scattered misfortune and more like a system working exactly as designed. Could the law have stopped this sooner? It tried, and it failed for decades, in exactly the way you'd expect. Public outrage over child labor in the breakers was loud enough by 1885 that Pennsylvania passed a law banning anyone under 12 from working in a coal breaker. On paper, that should have ended the worst of it right there. In practice, the law had no enforcement mechanism worth the name. There was no inspector standing at the breaker door checking birth records against the boys climbing the stairs. Parents, desperate for income, filed false affidavits about their sons' ages with local magistrates who cared more about the 25-cent filing fee than the truth of what was written on the form. Companies looked the other way. Because the boys were still cheaper than the alternative, the legislature tried again in 1903, raising the minimum age to 14 for breaker work and 16 for work underground. The same year, as it happens, that anthracite's biggest labor confrontation forced the federal government's hand for the first time in American history. The 1902 strike had shut the coal fields down for 163 days, dragged on long enough that President Theodore Roosevelt feared the entire Northeast would freeze through the coming winter, and ended only after Roosevelt convened an independent commission to investigate conditions in the mines and breakers directly. The commission's hearings ran for months. They produced thousands of pages of testimony from the very men, and occasionally the very boys, who worked these machines. The miners won a wage increase and a shorter day. The boys who'd marched in that strike right alongside their fathers won nothing written down at all. No wage floor, no seat at the table, not even a clause acknowledging that they were the ones sitting closest to the gears. They did not win recognition of their union, and they did not win an end to child labor in the breakers. That fight, infuriatingly, was still years from over. And here's the part that proves just how little those two laws actually accomplished. Historians' best estimates put roughly 20,000 breaker boys at work across Pennsylvania in 1880, 18,000 in 13,000 in 1902, right as the strike and its commission were making national headlines, and then 24,000 again by 1907. The number didn't fall in a straight line towards zero after each new law passed. It dipped, and then it climbed right back past where it started. 2 acts of the state legislature, an age limit in writing twice over, and the actual head count of working children went up. What finally moved the needle on the breaker boys specifically wasn't a law, it was a camera. In 1908, the National Child Labor Committee hired a photographer named Lewis Hine and sent him into the coal region to document exactly what these boys looked like at work. Soot blackened, soaked in coal dust so thick it filled their lungs. Some posed beside the very machines that had already taken pieces of them. Hine wrote his own field notes alongside the photographs, describing foremen who stood over the boys, prodding or kicking them into obedience, and dust so dense it sometimes obscured the camera's view entirely. The committee printed those images in pamphlets, hung them in magazine spreads, and sent Hine on lecture circuits across the country to show them to audiences who had never set foot anywhere near a coal breaker in their lives. Those images traveled the country in a way that statistics never had, and the public reaction to seeing a 9-year-old's face under a breaker's machinery did something decades of legislation hadn't managed. And here's the detail that should make you angry, the one we promised earlier. By March of 1913, at the Spencer Coal Company breaker in Scranton, a mechanical picking machine built by an inventor named Langerfeld was already running, a device that separated slate from coal mechanically, with no human hands involved at all. Boys doing the same job by hand let somewhere between 15 and 60% slate slip through into the clean coal. Langerfeld's machine got that contamination rate down to 1 or 2%. Better results, no missing fingers, no funerals. It existed, it worked, and it sat there for years, adopted in scattered locations while thousands of boys kept dangling their boots into the chutes elsewhere in the same coal region. Because installing machines cost money up front, and boys, tragically, did not. It took the combined weight of Hine's photographs, mounting public fury, Pennsylvania's stronger 1915 Enforcement Act, the slow spread of mechanization that companies had been avoiding for 2 decades, and compulsory schools' attendance laws finally catching up with reality before the practice genuinely began to end. By the early 1920s, breaker boys were largely gone from the anthracite fields. The federal government didn't lock the door for good until the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, 2 decades after Pennsylvania's own region had already moved on without them. The boys were gone. The buildings they died in were not. Not yet. What the mountain remembers. So what would all of this actually buy the country? More than a century of anthracite heat for homes and furnaces across the entire industrial Northeast. The coal that warmed apartments in New York and Philadelphia fired the boilers of the railroads that connected them, and fed the furnaces of an iron and steel industry that was, at the time, building the rest of industrial America on top of it. A region that, at its peak, employed something close to 175,000 people, directly in mining, and supported close to 1 million more around them. An entire branch of American industry, railroads included, built on the back of coal that had to pass through a building like this one before it could be sold. Remember the question we keep circling back to: what did it actually cost to keep that supply chain running? We're about to put a final number on it, but the breakers themselves didn't outlive their usefulness gracefully, and neither did the boys' replacements stay needed for long. After World War II, oil and natural gas started displacing anthracite in home furnaces. Diesel locomotives replaced coal-burning ones. By 1938, The region's total anthracite tonnage had already fallen to less than half of what it had been just 20 years earlier. One by one, through the 1950 seconds, 60 seconds, and 70 seconds, the great breakers shut down, were stripped for parts, and came down. Here's the part of the story that deserves to be said plainly, because it's easy to get wrong. The breaker most people can still find photographs of. The 11-story, 134-foot Huber breaker in Ashley, Pennsylvania, built by the Glen Alden Coal Company in 1939, processing 7,000 tons of coal a day through state-of-the-art Menzies water separation cones, never legally employed a single breaker boy. It couldn't have. By the time its doors opened, the laws had finally caught up, and the practice had already ended in that region. The Huber was built to replace an older wooden structure on that exact site, the Maxwell breaker, which very likely had run boys through its chutes for generations before federal and state law finally closed that door. So, the machine you can still find pictures of isn't the one that did it, but it's standing, or rather it stood, for 75 years on the exact ground where the older one did. The Huber ran until 1976, when its parent company, Blue Coal, went bankrupt and shut the operation down for good. It sat abandoned for nearly 4 decades after that, a hulking 11-story ruin visible from the highway, while a dedicated preservation society tried to save it. They lost. In 2013, a salvage company outbid them for the property by more than $1 million, and in 2014 the Huber came down, first the outbuildings in January, then the main structure in April, then the powerhouse in August. The demolition kicked up a black cloud of dust that residents watched drift toward their own neighborhoods, and questions about whether the asbestos inside the old building had been handled properly followed the site for years afterward, all the way into a state investigation. That's what remains of the species today. Almost nothing standing, scattered ruins, a handful of preserved chutes and tipples turned into museum pieces and coal manks. The black, man-made mountains of leftover waste rack still dotting the landscape of Schuylkill, Luzerne, and Lackawanna counties. Even those waste piles haven't been left alone. In recent years, some mine property owners have found new profit reprocessing old coal manks for the fuel still buried inside them, a strange, quiet echo of the original machine. Minus the children, the towns that grew up around the original breakers emptied out right along with them. Population numbers that once supported opera houses and crowded downtowns have been quietly shrinking for half a century. Not far from where some of these breakers stood, a town called Centralia has spent more than 60 years being slowly evacuated because of an underground coal seam fire that's been burning unstoppably since 1962. A separate disaster, but proof that this region's relationship with fire and coal underground never fully ended either. And maybe that's part of why the hauntings never really stopped. Pennsylvania's coal region has one of the densest collections of documented ghost folklore in the entire state, and it didn't start with modern ghost hunting television. In 1872, the Scranton Publican reported that miners at the Bellevue shaft had encountered a 6-foot vaporous white apparition underground. In 1898, miners near Neshannock told of a ghost miner who entered the mine each night with his own pick and lamp, worked steadily until dawn, and then vanished without a trace before anyone could get close. In 1906, workers at a Delaware and Hudson mine refused to enter a section of the Taylor mine entirely, convinced a glowing, hollow-eyed figure was guarding it. A folklorist named George Corson spent the 1920 seconds and 30 seconds traveling through the coal patch towns, collecting these stories directly from the people who told them. And what he found was less a handful of campfire tales than an entire regional tradition built around the dead who never seemed to leave the ground that killed them. Were these boys among the figures the miners reported seeing in the dark? Nobody can prove that, and we're not going to pretend otherwise. But academics who study the region today have started calling the ruins of these breakers something specific. Not just abandoned buildings, but haunted landscapes, sites where the physical scars of extraction and the unresolved grief of generations of mining families sit on top of each other in the same dirt. One researcher who grew up beside the ruins of a different breaker, the St. Nicholas, described walking the kill banks and feeling haunted, not by a ghost in the traditional sense, but by the realization that the catastrophe itself, the lost fingers, the lost legs, the boys who never came home from a shift, was never really finished. It just stopped being visible. The region has tried, in its own way, to keep that memory from disappearing along with the buildings. The Anthracite Heritage Museum, not far from where some of the largest breakers once stood, preserves the equipment, the photographs, and the oral histories of the families who lived this. A composer named Julia Wolfe spent years researching the breaker boys and the mining families behind them before writing a piece called Anthracite Fields, built in part on interviews and recovered names of the dead, work that went on to win a Pulitzer Prize, and that Wolfe herself is performed in the same coal towns where the people in the audience still have grandparents who worked these machines. That's a strange kind of haunting, too. An entire art form built out of trying not to let a region forget its own children. So, here's the answer to the question we opened with. How did a machine built to crush rock end up needing the smallest hands in Pennsylvania to finish the job? Because somebody ran the numbers and decided a child's hand was cheaper than a Menzies cone or a Langerfeld picker, and kept deciding that for the better part of 70 years, law or no law. And why does the ground still feel haunted, more than a century later, in a region where almost every one of these machines has been torn down and sold for scrap? Because the towns emptied, the names were never widely remembered outside a few historical societies, and the iron throats that swallowed those boys are mostly gone now, too. But the dirt they stood on, and the people who buried their sons under it, never got the chance to forget. They don't make machines like that anymore. They don't put children inside the ones we do make either. Pennsylvania just hasn't found a way to stop remembering both. Not in its museums, not in its music. And apparently, if you believe the men who still won't walk certain shafts after dark, not underground either.